Well, hello and welcome to my channel, The Withered Fig Tree. My name is Randy Silva, and I've been doing live streams about the importance of the Holy Spirit in the lives of Christians. And today is part 7 of the series that is called The History of Judaism. So let's get started. We've got a lot to cover today. The title of part 7 is Judaism After the Temple, a Sacrifice to Tradition. Now, before we begin, I want to establish some principles here. The first 6 episodes were a lot of history and also some theology and talking about how Judaism formed and how God needed to start his own nation in order to birth the Messiah. These last 2 episodes that we'll be talking about the history of Judaism from after the Third Jewish-Roman War up until the present, those potentially could become more political, or at least viewed as political. That's not my intention. So let me just read a couple things that I wrote here. People must be free to believe, question, and critique their own religion and the religion of others without fear. Truth does not require coercion, and any system that depends on intimidation reveals weakness, not strength. Any system of faith that uses coercion, threats of violence, or actual violence, I believe, has invalidated itself and reflects not the Spirit of God, but the opposite. I would say that truth invites. It does not compel, it does not intimidate, it does not punish, it does not cancel. Now, while our beliefs shape our understanding of what is right and wrong, public life, I believe, must operate on principles that can be openly examined and shared across differences. The bridge between faith and society is moral reasoning, not enforced doctrine. I believe there is also a necessary humility one has to have when it comes to spiritual claims. The spiritual realm is, first of all, not observable. No one has died and come back from the dead besides one person, that is Jesus Christ. Certainly in modern times, though, we don't have anybody claiming to have died and gone to the afterlife and have all of the answers. So our understanding comes from ancient texts that require translation, integration, and interpretation. This level of uncertainty should make us cautious about asserting our religious views in ways that materially affect others' lives, security, or livelihood. And that especially goes for people who are in positions of power, like positions within the government or within Congress or the Senate, the president, and other high positions in other countries. So those are some principles that I believe are very important, and they're definitely not the case when it comes to Islam. You can definitely run into trouble if you criticize Islam. You may even have violence against you or be killed. And I believe there's a similar movement towards that in Judaism, not to that extent, but more to the extent nowadays that one can be considered anti-Semitic or be canceled just because of their religious opinions on their own religion and the religion of Judaism. As we near the end of this series on the history of Judaism, my intent is not to be political. However, it would be unrealistic to ignore the fact that Judaism and just religion in general, or more broadly speaking, intersects with modern political realities. These would include the relationship, for instance, between Israel and the United States, as well as the role of religion in the governments of other nations, for instance, in the Middle East. That said, my focus here is not on political advocacy, but on historical and Christian theological understanding. So with this in mind, I had posted a link to a video from Charlie Kirk in the description for last week's episode 6. I should say that I have been and still am a big fan of Charlie Kirk. I believe he's very articulate, he's very well versed and highly knowledgeable across many political topics, many of which I agreed with him. Of course, Charlie Kirk was assassinated. And I believe that he was keenly aware of the moral connections of politics to Christianity. That said, he does not and really cannot speak for all Christians. Christianity has a wide range of beliefs. And so it's basically impossible to make any sort of Christian statement and be speaking for Christianity as a whole. Even if the Pope makes statements, he's speaking for Catholicism, not for all of Christianity. My purpose of bringing up Charlie Kirk's video was simply this. From the perspective of this series, The History of Judaism, and also my previous work, and really as the channel as a whole, The Withered Fig Tree, I believe that Charlie Kirk was wrong on the subject of Israel. So let's take a closer look. Hopefully you had a chance to watch that video. If you didn't, it's in the link to it. It's a YouTube short, so it's only like 2 minutes. And the link to it is in the description of episode 6. So the video starts with an audience member. Of course, that's how Charlie Kirk ran a lot of his meetings. He would, sit in front, and the audience could come up to the microphone and ask freely any question. And this particular audience member was very sincere, and she asked, where should a Christian's loyalty stand when it comes to Israel? And then she asked a related question, is the new covenant truly transcendent? Does it alter everything that came before it? So those are both very valid and, I would say, interesting questions. And they both appear to be entirely spiritually based, but because of the modern mixing of religion and politics, the waters can get muddied very quickly. Now, Charlie begins answering the audience member's question with a question of his own. And I don't really think it was a good question that he asked. He asked, do you think God breaks his promises? Now, in debate and logic, this type of a question is called a loaded question, and it can also be called, or it also is, a false dilemma. It presents only two options, one of which is obvious, and the other of which, if one disagreed, they would really exit the topic of the debate. So the two options in this case, do you think that God breaks his promises? The obvious answer is yes, he keeps his promises, and therefore one must support Charlie's view of Israel and the United States relations. If you go with the opposite, that God breaks his promises, then you reject God's faithfulness, and really all bets are off the table. The audience member answers, no, she does not believe that God breaks his promises. God keeps his promises. But I believe there's a third and more accurate answer. God does keep his promises, but we must correctly understand to whom the promises are made and what the covenant behind the promise actually requires. It's a more nuanced answer. Charlie then partially quotes from Genesis chapter 17, verse 7, and this is where God establishes an everlasting covenant with Abraham and his descendants, including the promise of the land of Canaan, and it is an everlasting possession. It's an everlasting promise and an everlasting possession. Those are the words that are used. He then makes a statement that sounds logical. He says, this must either be an exaggerative writing or a literal everlasting covenant with the people of Israel. Now let's take a look at this, because I believe it's another false dilemma. It's definitely not an exaggeration. That's the obvious answer. If someone were to say God's exaggerating here, God does not exaggerate, especially when he makes these clear statements about it being an everlasting covenant. So the real questions are, what is the covenant and who is it actually for? And a covenant by definition has two parties. Now God is on one side, one of the parties, and he will definitely keep his side of the covenant and his promises. But the question is, what is required by the other side? Now, the passage, this is Genesis chapter 17, right after this, it starts talking about circumcision. So circumcision is part of the covenant, but is that the only thing? Is anyone who follows that covenant and circumcises himself and all other males and servants in his household, are they now immediately a part of the covenant? And people in Israel would say no, because it also has to do with being a descendant of Abraham. So it's not just circumcision. And the other thing is that the passage explicitly says that circumcision is actually just a sign of the covenant. The core of the covenant is stated twice in this passage, and it's a little bit harder to find, or it's easy to miss. It's once in verse 7 and once in verse 8. The statement really is, I will be their God. That is the covenant, that God will be their God, and therefore the other people, God will be their God. In other words, the promise applies to those who are in a covenant relationship with God, those who live under his authority. So he doesn't actually give a lot of detail of what the covenant is. He doesn't have to, because he just says, here's what it has to be. It's going to be the descendants of Abraham, and we're going to find out it's not all of the descendants of Abraham. And they have to circumcise themselves, the males. They have to make God their God. And then later on, he says, I will establish covenants with, or explain this covenant in more detail to your ancestors, to answer the question, what does it mean for God to be your God? Even within Genesis itself, you'd see that the promise is not applied to all of Abraham's descendants. So God's talking to Abraham right now, and Abraham already has a son, Ishmael. So that's definitely a descendant of Abraham, and yet Ishmael is not a part of the promise. God chooses Isaac, who's not even born at this point, but God promises that he will have a child in his old age. And then among Isaac's sons, God chooses Jacob, not Esau. And from there, Jacob's descendants, so his 12 sons, they become the people of Israel. And even then, though, the land doesn't exist, not for 430 years. They are in Egypt, first in a cooperative position, but then they are enslaved by Egypt. And so they're in Egypt. They're not in the promised land of Canaan. The generation that leaves Egypt wanders and dies in the wilderness. They're led, of course, by Moses after the plagues and after the splitting of the Red Sea. And because of their faithlessness, they themselves, even Moses, does not inherit get to live in the promised land. Only that generation's children, so the next generation, along with Joshua and Caleb, they are the ones who will actually inherit this promise of the land. So the pattern is clear. The promise is selective, conditional, and covenantal. It is not a blanket inheritance for all the physical descendants of Abraham. And this matters because if Charlie was going to answer the audience member's question fully, maybe, of course, you might not expect him to go into the amount of detail that I'm going, but just to even answer the question faithfully, he would have to define the heirs of the promise much more precisely. It is the covenant people, those who descend from Jacob and who live under the covenant that God establishes with them. And that brings us now to the central question for this episode, and really I would say the theme of this series, The History of Judaism. Can that covenant actually be followed today? Can what we as Christians call the Old Covenant, for Jewish people it is just the covenant. And by can, I mean, is it even possible, given the nature of the law itself, for anyone, even in principle, to live under that covenant in the modern world? So I'm not saying, is it even possible for a human to have the amount of discipline and faithfulness and conviction? Let's just assume that those people exist. I'm saying, can that law, given the nature of the law, actually be followed in our modern society? And I believe the answer that this series gives is no. And that is because the Old Covenant requires a temple, and the temple was destroyed in 70 AD. And without that temple, nearly a third of the laws in the covenant cannot be followed. So the entire foundation of Charlie's argument collapses because it depends on the ongoing applicability of that covenant. And what I've shown is that there's a lot more nuance and a lot more information that's needed in order to answer the question before you can continue on. But he does continue on, and he does make two other important claims that I think should be talked about. One is he talks about end times prophecy, and the other is what he calls replacement theory. And he didn't make up that term, that's an existing term. And I disagree with both of those concepts. In my prior series, The Seven Spirits of Revelation, I argued that books like Daniel and Revelation primarily point to the destruction of the temple, not to events at the end of the world. And I also emphasize how difficult apocalyptic literature is. So both of those books are written, the prophecies are written apocalyptically. Apocalyptic literature is extremely difficult to interpret, given its symbolic and numeric symbolisms and imagery, and how precarious it is to build real-world conclusions on any one interpretation. Now, as for replacement theory, it's typically described as the idea that the Christian church replaced the Jews as God's people, and that the new covenant replaces the old. So that has to do with the second question that the audience member asked. Now, from a strictly spiritual, faithful Christian perspective, drawing especially from books like Romans and Hebrews, there is a lot of truth in that framework of replacement theory. But the term replacement is intentionally pejorative. Nobody wants to be replaced, right? And I think because of that, it's misleading. I would argue a better word is fulfillment theology. The covenants are not competing systems. They are parts of a single unified plan that God made, tracing all the way back to the fall and culminating in Jesus Christ, the Messiah. That's obviously a Christian perspective. In that sense, the Jewish people were not punitively replaced. Rather, the plan of God moved forward to its intended fulfillment and Abrahamic promise. Okay, so that's some coverage of the Charlie Kirk video. Let's move on to today's history lessons, as it were. Okay, so Judaism from the Third Roman War until the 6th century AD. This is where we left off last week, was with the Third Roman War. Now, in the 1st and 2nd centuries AD, we talked about the destruction of the temple in 70 AD. And then that was during the First War. And then there were two other large Jewish-Roman wars, not just conflicts, but wars. combined with the destruction of the temple, combined with the widespread death and displacement from the 3 Jewish-Roman wars, that disrupted the cultural continuity of Judaism, and it created confusion, disillusionment, and really the risk of cultural fragmentation. After the Third War, the Jewish population may have dropped from its height of around 7 to 8 million in the beginning of the first century AD to roughly 3 to 5 million worldwide. So a large number of Jews were killed in those 3 wars. So Judaism is forced even more decisively into a post-temple rabbinic path. So it's often called post-temple Judaism is often called rabbinic Judaism. Now, in the late 2nd century AD, rabbinic leadership consolidates in Galilee, with temple worship gone and Jerusalem largely inaccessible as a Jewish center. With that being the case, rabbinic authority and legal tradition become the major framework for Jewish community. Now, in 200 AD, a man by the name of Rabbi Judah ha-Nasi, he is the person who is behind the compilation of the Jewish work called the Mishnah. And this is very important to modern Judaism, or post-temple Judaism. Now, ha-Nasi means the prince, and so he was also had some sort of power and wealth. He took it upon himself to assemble the Mishnah, which becomes the first major written codification of the oral law and the foundation for later rabbinic Judaism and both Talmuds. And the Talmuds we'll talk about in a second, but those are also books that go off of the Mishnah and continue codifying the oral law. So before this, you had the Old Covenant that was written down. The Old Testament was written down. But the teachings of the Pharisees, or the rules of the Pharisees, those were how you apply those laws to your life and how you live as a Jew. That was all oral law, part of it just because of history and difficulty in writing things down, but more so because that was how you fulfilled Deuteronomy 6 about writing the law on your hearts and in your minds. Now, if he had not compiled the Mishnah in 200 AD, it's difficult to say what would have happened with Judaism, but I think it's fair to say that rabbinic Judaism probably would have survived, but would have been in a much weaker, looser, and regionally fragmented form. In 313 AD, we talked about this in the History of Christianity series. In 313 AD, Constantine issued the Edict of Milan, and that meant that Christianity received legal toleration from the Roman Empire, and it marked a major shift in the empire's religious direction. And then we also talked about 325 AD, the Council of Nicaea under Constantine. Constantine had become a Christian, and he wanted to know what it meant to be a Christian, and it seemed like he was having a hard time getting some answers. So he funded and called upon elders or bishops from all of the regions around the known world to come to the city and work it out. And that was called the Council of Nicaea. After Constantine, you see Constantine II, Constans, and Constantius II. Those are the next 3 emperors, and they all claim to be Christians and support strongly Christianity. But then, after Constantius II, comes this kind of standout emperor named Julian, and he's actually given the title the apostate because he went against Christianity. He wasn't a Christian, and he didn't think that the prior emperor's moves to Christianity were correct, and so he reversed course and encourages paganism. He didn't make Christianity illegal. I think he knew that would cause a revolt, but he encourages paganism, and he knows about Judaism and what happened to the temple in 70 AD. So he asks them, as a slight against Christianity, to rebuild the Jerusalem temple on the Temple Mount. And this really is, before researching this, I didn't know about it. It's such a remarkable, might have been moment that really all Christians and all Jewish people should know about it. Maybe more Jews know about it than Christians, I don't know. It's this sort of obscure moment in history, but it's so important that this pagan emperor, opposed to Constantine's Christian direction, briefly opens the door for temple restoration. Now you can see he was only emperor for 3 years, really 3 different years, but his actual term was only 2 years. And the project fails, and Julian then dies himself, which is kind of a travesty from the Roman standpoint, that an emperor in battle would actually be taken down. He dies in a war in Persia, which is modern-day Iran. Let's go into a little bit more detail about this rebuilding of the temple in 361 AD. It's really a crazy story. So the Emperor Hadrian, that's the guy I was trying to think of earlier. Hadrian, after crushing the Bar Kokhba revolt in 135 AD, built a temple to Jupiter in connection with the old temple site. So this was an intentional violation of Old Testament law, and the Jews were generally barred from entering the city and the Temple Mount. It was a very much political and religious humiliation of Judaism, that standing now in the temple's place is a temple to Jupiter. It was definitely not just a neutral civic project. The temple would have to be removed for the temple of Jupiter, I should say, would have to be removed in order for the Jews to build the third temple. There's this historian, Ammianus Marcellinus. He's a 4th century Roman historian, and he was a pagan. And he was broadly sympathetic to Julian. He was a friend of Julian. He was picked by Julian to be the empire's historian. And his report is fairly short and restrained. It's in this Latin book, Res Gestae, book 23, chapter 1, something like that. So what he reports, though, is he says that Julian wanted to restore the temple at Jerusalem at vast cost and assigned the work to Alypius of Antioch. Ammianus then says that while the work was being pushed forward, this is exactly, these are quotes from his history, fearsome globes and balls of fire burst out from near the foundations of the old temple and burned the workers repeatedly, and it made the place inaccessible, and the project was abandoned. So he presents this as a physical event at the site, and he's not you think a Christian historian might say saw maybe there was a fire in a bush and somebody got burned, and he turned that into, a fish story of sorts, expanded it and, made it into some sort of act of God. But here's this person who's this pagan believer who talks about these globes of fire that start coming out from the foundations and making the place inaccessible. So it really is hard to come to any other conclusion that God thwarted their plan to rebuild the temple. Certainly from a Christian perspective, but even historically, I think pagans and atheists would have to say something like, wow, this was, if nothing else, really bad luck that somehow balls of fire, pockets of gas or something burst out and burned a lot of people. I don't know. Whatever they would come up with, it would be, they would seem like they were stretching it. Okay, so that's very important. So the last attempt to rebuild the temple in post Second Temple history was in 361, and it was thwarted by God. In the 4th and 5th centuries AD, you see that the Jerusalem, what's also called the Palestinian, that was the name that Hadrian gave the place at that time. He's the one that named it Palestinia. So you see the Jerusalem Talmud take shape. So you have the Mishnah, and the Mishnah is a collection of all the oral teachings, the oral sayings of historic rabbis from as late as, or as early, I guess you'd say, as the 5th century BC, all the way up until 200 AD. So this Talmud is built around the Mishnah and the rabbinic discussions. This one was not really completed in its fullest form, at least not at this time. So that was the Jerusalem Talmud. Now, in 380 AD, Theodosius I makes Nicene Christianity the imperial standard. So what Constantine began in patronage and protection becomes, under Theodosius, a far more explicit Christian imperial order. It really becomes the religion of the Romans. And this really makes Julian's temple rebuilding moment look even more like just a brief historical exception. We go all the way up to the 6th century AD. That's where we'll stop today. The Babylonian Talmud is compiled, and this one is much fuller and eventually more authoritative rabbinic work. It built on the Mishnah, and remember Babylon was in the area of what is now modern day Iraq. So the name doesn't have anything to do with like Babylonian religion or gods or anything. It just has to do with the region. It's mentioned as far outstripping the Palestinian Talmud and in later Jewish influence. And the reason why they were writing these Talmuds is because Judaism still needed legal rulings, debate, and continuity in this post-temple world. Specifically in the absence of the sacrificial system and in the absence of any sort of law that had to do with the temple, they needed to come up with some sort of replacement. Reflected the questions, customs, and legal discussions of the Babylonian Jewish world, and it was a little bit different from those who were in Palestine, who wrote the other Talmud. So you have the Mishnah and the Talmud, and those are the two major historical writings of Judaism modern Judaism. And of course you have the Old Testament, the Torah, the prophets, and the writings, the Psalms. Okay, well, I hope you enjoyed this episode about the post-temple, post-Third Jewish-Roman War up to the 6th century history of Judaism, as well as the commentary on the Charlie Kirk video. Next week will be the final episode of this series, The History of Judaism, and we'll talk about from the 6th century all the way up until modern times. Have a great day. Remember to like and subscribe and share with your friends.